getting started. We've got lots of business to do, and welcome to meeting number 103 of the House of Commons Committee on the Status of Women. Today's meeting is taking place in hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders, and members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Today we do have our witnesses online, so I'm sure that the clerk has already shared with you just to make sure you choose your language of choice, or French or English, and we ask that you mute yourself or unmute yourself depending on whether you're speaking or not. Just reminding everybody in the room, just make sure that our earpieces stay away from our microphones, as it will have a negative impact to our translators. And a reminder that all comments should come through the chair, and just if we have a speaking list, I'll be sure to get your names. Today we are continuing on the standing order of 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, November 27th of 2024. The committee will resume its study of the implementation of the red dress alert. And today, online, we have two excellent witnesses coming to us from the Greater Sudbury Police Service. We have Clee Liveris, who is the Detective Constable for Missing Person Investigator, as well, and he is with Daryl Rivers, who is a constable. So what we will be doing, is it 5 or 10 minutes?
5 together.
5. So what we have provided is 5 minutes together for both of them, since they are both from the Sudbury Police Force, but we will have till 4:30 to ask our questions. So I am going to pass the floor over to both of you, and one of you decide who's going to take the floor. You have 5 minutes, and when you see my arms start flailing, wind it down, okay? You have the floor.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and committee members. First of all, I appreciate the invitation to speak on this important topic today, this red dress alert, and acknowledge that we're the only police service speaking here, at least the only one I've been made aware of. And for those who aren't aware, the City of Greater Sudbury covers a landmass of approximately 5 times the City of Toronto, while it's only home to about 160,000 people. The Greater Sudbury Police Service acknowledges the historical role that police have played in Canadian history. I also understand why some don't want my police service or any police service involved in this important endeavor. However, we all need to be partners in this red dress alert in order to make it more effective. I encourage family members, community members, and community partners to conduct welfare checks on their loved ones when it's appropriate. However, if community-based efforts fail to locate a person, police should be involved at the earliest possible stage. Members of police services have investigative resources that members of the general public simply do not. Ontario and several other provinces have enacted legislation, such as the Missing Persons Act, which can be utilized by police officers to obtain information that wouldn't otherwise be available. We're able to utilize this investigative tool to access information such as cell phone records, financial records, medical records, when appropriate, as well as internet records. These investigative tools are only available to members of police service and are solely used to locate missing persons and ensure their safety. We also have records from other police services from across the country, and when necessary, we can reach outside of Canadian borders. Early access to these investigative resources brings a higher likelihood of the best possible outcomes when searching for a missing person. When, not if, this red dress alert system becomes available, I see it as a valuable resource to assist in locating your loved ones. In order to be effective, I believe the system needs to be tiered. It needs to be scalable from a local to a provincial to a national alert when the situation calls for it. It needs to be flexible to address the needs of both the local community and the nation as a whole. It needs to balance the privacy of a missing person with the need for assistance from the public. The system needs to use clearly defined risk factors, indicating when alert is utilized, what the level of that alert and the scope of that alert would be. We need to grab the attention of the public with these alerts when it's sent out. We also have to take into consideration alert fatigue. We need the community to engage and provide whatever information they have, whatever tips they have, to move the investigation towards the best possible outcome. I'll hand it over to our Indigenous Liaison Officer, Daryl Rivers, to speak further on community engagement.
Ani, Madam Chair and committee members. My name is Constable Daryl Rivers. I am the Indigenous Liaison Officer for the Greater Sudbury Police Service. The City of Sudbury has one of the largest growing Indigenous populations in Canada and the fastest growing in Ontario. According to StatScan, the city of Sudbury will have the largest urban Indigenous population by 2036. There are approximately 22 First Nations communities within a 2-hour drive of the city, which makes us a hub to access various services in Northern Ontario. In order for the Greater Sudbury Police to best serve the community we live and work in, community engagement has been a priority. All police services need to be involved from the onset of every missing persons investigation. The Greater Sudbury Police Service has a long-standing relationship with our Indigenous community and agencies since the late 90s, where a need for an Indigenous liaison officer was identified, and also a body of Indigenous representatives from various Indigenous organizations within the city. From that, our Indigenous Advisory Committee was created. Over the years, this committee meets quarterly with our Chief of Police to discuss issues, challenges from the community, and work collaboratively to identify opportunities for solutions. From this co-led body, a grant was received, and a committee was created to raise awareness within the city through community initiatives and police officer training. One of these initiatives from this collaboration was the creation of the Indigenous Women and Girls Missing Person Toolkit and Resource Guide. At the conclusion of this project, a monument was created. An approximately 15-foot aluminum red dress with the words "No More Stolen Sisters" in the center of it was placed on the side of the building of one of our community partners. I am the third Indigenous liaison officer to sit in this role and benefit greatly from those who came before me. It is imperative that all police services across the country build and/or rebuild trust with community so that when the Red Dress Alert system becomes active, it can be a more effective resource to assist police in locating loved ones. Miigwech for your time and opportunity for this presentation.
And thank you very much for coming here with your testimony today. We will be starting with our 6-minute round, and each party will get 6 minutes to ask questions. I'll start off with Michelle Frary with Conservatives. Michelle, 6 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you so much to our witnesses for this important study. I guess the first question I would ask is, what are your current biggest obstacles through Sudbury? You're both with the Greater Sudbury Police Service. In and when we have these, missing women, Indigenous women or girls, what would be the biggest?
I'm not hearing anything.
Oh, you can't hear me. I saw
One
you
second.
taking no, and I was like, no.
1 second, please. I'll just.
Okay.
Okay. Are you able to hear me? Can you hear my voice? Can you hear me right now? Yes or no? No? Not at all? Okay, I'll pass it over to the clerk. 1 moment, please. We are going to suspend to ensure that everything is working. Currently, do either of the gentlemen hear me? Thumbs up, nothing, nothing, nothing? Okay, we're going to suspend until we get this fixed. meeting, and thank you very much. Our camera issue or our issues have been fixed. We will start this round over again, and I'm going to pass the floor to Michelle Frary. Michelle?
Thank you, Chair. Let's try this one more time. Can you guys hear me? Can I get a hoo-ha? Okay, that's awesome. Thank you guys for being here, and thank you for being part of this really important study. And as police officers, I think you're going to be a very important piece of this discussion. Currently, with the Greater Peterborough or Sudbury Police Service, what would you say are your biggest obstacles without this red dress alert when that critical time period happens when you have a missing Indigenous woman or girl, ensuring that they are brought home safely?
I would say our biggest obstacle when we need that immediate action is the delays in associated to putting out our release, having it picked up by the media, and then forwarded on to the general public. Unless we're dealing with an Amber Alert, which obviously goes through a different system, but that's where the delay is. Well, it only might be minutes in the middle of the day when mainstream media is at work. If we put out a release at 2 a.m., it may not get picked up till 8 a.m.
Interesting. So the delay, if I understand correctly, is really you're at sort of the mercy of the media to release whatever you have. You have social media now, which I know a lot of my police rely on, or the police in my region rely on heavily. But when you're in really rural communities or you don't have great Wi-Fi, that can't always be super reliable either. Is that what I'm hearing?
So we put it out on our social media.
Yeah.
We use Twitter or X as well as Facebook as our two main platforms. But if you're not following us as a police service, you're not going to see it. We do encourage family members and other community members to either to forward our post or to screenshot it or however. But you're still relying on someone paying attention to someone else's social media. It's not going out to the whole public in general.
Do you find that there is a lag of reaching out to the police to report a missing person, in particular Indigenous women or girl?
I think here we've had great success and we've got good relations with our community. I do know it is an issue I've had community members here whose loved one is in a different service area, and they're hesitant to go to that police service, or there's some other barriers in place. So it is not a universal barrier, but it is a barrier that does exist.
It sounds like you've worked very hard to establish important relationships and trust, which I feel like you said in your opening statements, which is critical to this discussion as well.
I'm going to give all that credit, or most of that credit, over to Rivers and his predecessors, but it is something we work on a daily basis. I work particularly very closely with our child welfare agencies, and we have 3 Indigenous agencies here in the city, and I work with them on our kids every day.
Yeah, thank you for that. I guess one of the big things we have with this study, and I like how you said it's not a matter of if, it's when. I think the logistics have been one of the most sort of biggest issues we have, and what we want to sort of really carve out with this study in status of women. How does this roll out? How do we effectively ensure that there is the right person or people or organization in charge of Red Dress Alert? Who should be the person or organization responsible? And I guess I would ask you guys, as you're here today from Greater Sudbury Police Service, because you did point out some concerns to ensure that it is rolled out effectively. And in comparison to Amber Alert, what do you think would be the most effective way that this program would be rolled out, this alert system?
So we've spoken about using a tiered system of alerts. Starting at the lowest level would be a closed-ish system that we kind of use right now within our community service agencies, our shelters, our Friendship Center, and things like that. So when we have someone who goes missing, we literally just send an email out to them so that they're aware of the person, and then they can reach back out to us. And these are generally people who we're dealing with on a little bit more of a regular basis. I love the idea, the witness from, I believe it was Nova Scotia, with their Enbridge system, with their more local alerts going out to those who are subscribed to it as like a second tier of alert. So those who want to know in the general public have the option to know a lot more, maybe with a lower threshold to sending that alert out, with like the highest level of alert being reserved for where there is some like concern for serious bodily harm or death in police lingo or foul play. And that being sent out much like an Amber Alert to everyone over multiple streams, via TV, radio, cell phone, like everybody's phone blowing up, both of mine blowing up, being reserved so that it captures everybody's attention when it's actually used.
If you want to table it to the committee, I'm curious what your stats are in Sudbury, if you have them, of murdered or missing Indigenous women in your region.
So our time is up for that. So I would ask of both gentlemen, if you can send in some of that data that you have, that'd be fantastic. But what I'm going to do now is throw the floor over to Mark. Mark, you have the floor for 6.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses of Greater Sudbury for the work that you do in my hometown, and obviously thank you for explaining to the committee what Greater Sudbury Police Force has done since the 90s about trying to gain trust with an advisory committee, a dedicated constable, and training an officer. So my first question is just quickly, what's the composition of your advisory committee that meets with the chief on a regular basis?
Our Indigenous Advisory Committee is comprised of a member from various Indigenous-run organizations within the city. We also invite the 3 Indigenous child welfare agencies, school boards. Each school board has a Indigenous support workers, so we utilize them a lot. So they meet quarterly. Directly with the chief or senior leadership. We provide updates on our programs and initiatives that we're planning. We get their input. They bring concerns from the community to the table and relay that information directly to the chief.
Okay. No, thank you. And as you indicated, there's 22 First Nations within about 2 hours. Northern Ontario has 110 First Nations, so there's a lot of work to be done with the communities. And I want to follow up on my colleague Michelle Ferreri's questioning about the Amber Alert, because I want you to give the committee here some context, because in Northern Ontario, like many other regions in the country, there is like the Anishinaabe Police that's based out of the Sault Ste. Marie and have also in North Bay. So there's that police force. There's also in other areas outside Greater Sudbury the OPP, and then you have the city police. So what is your interaction when we're dealing with, especially when you're looking at human trafficking and missing Indigenous women, how do you interact between the 3, and how does that fit into that tiered system that you talked about for alerts?
So currently, I like to say we have a really good working relationship with the services around us, especially when it comes to missing Indigenous people and females in particular. Closest relation would be the OPP surrounds us. We also have UCCM police on the Manitoulin Island, as well as the Wikwemicong tribal police. If we have information that our missing female is headed that way, might be that way, has family in that place, or simply has been there in the past, we have generally no issues obtaining assistance from that service. Even if we don't need them to do anything in particular, right now we use what are called zone alerts, which are targeted messages to police services. So if I think someone's headed to Sault Ste. Marie, I can send a zone alert along the highway, hitting every detachment and police service between Sudbury and Sault Ste. Marie. Or if I think they're headed to Toronto, I can go from here to Toronto, so that everybody's on the lookout for that female, that vehicle, whatever we're looking for.
Can you expand a bit? We had at the committee from Pelham-Rex. Do you know about the committee, SORN, the Committee of Public Service of all the provinces? Are you aware of that group nationally, or Ontario?
I am, because of what the witness from Palmerix said. But
Okay. So yeah, okay. We use this. Okay, thank you. So I wanted to then, when you're looking at the Esnobie Police Force, the OPP, municipal police, how do you? Can you explain a bit more your recommendations when you talk about the three-tier? I'm assuming you're talking about those zones, alert tier 1. We talked about the tier 2, that may be like what Sandra from Nova Scotia talked about, and then the tier 3 about a national alerts. But can you explain a bit more your recommendations along that line so that federal government could work? And my next question after that is the role of the province in all this.
So I think you had it basically correct there, using the zone alerts or the community alerts at the lowest level, and using that Palmerix, like the subscription-based model that could be enacted in most, sorry, not Palmerix, the Everbridge subscription-based model that communities could have set up. For example, like Sudbury does use the Everbridge system for our Greater Sudbury alerts, which are so if mines all around here. So if you want to know what a mine disaster, you sign up for that Sudbury alerts. But then when we get to the level where there's that threat of serious bodily harm, death, or foul play for the Indigenous female, using like the Weather Network Amber Alert style blast out. And we could target that like they do the piloted gray alerts in Quebec to localities, or larger regions, whether it be northeastern Ontario, northern Ontario in general, or the province, and then expanding out from there. I also keep in mind that even within Ontario, if you're in Ottawa, Quebec's not far away. If you're in Kenora, I know Kenora and Winnipeg have a lot of interactions when it comes to missing parties and human trafficking, travel of Indigenous women, for sure.
Do you have... Okay, so my time is up, but if you're dealing with men and boys, part of your advisory, can you send this over to the committee as far as any recommendations? Because we had our Spirit Brothers colleague here, Mitch Bourbonnière, really talk about how to involve men and boys. So if there's anything that the Sudbury Regional Police is doing with the community on that for men and boys, please share the committee. My time is up.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, and a great request. So I'm now going to pass it over to Adrienne. Adrienne, you have 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, both witnesses, for being with us this evening. First off, I'd like to ask Mr. Levers a question. You said in your introductory remarks that there is a risk that these alerts, that there's a risk of fatigue with these alerts, that what could be done so that the population doesn't feel overwhelmed by these alerts and do not want to respond to them by virtue of that?
There's a couple things that we can do in order to prevent what we kind of coined as alert fatigue. First is having thresholds so that we have, for example, in Sudbury, in the neighborhood of 600 missing Indigenous persons reported every year. And most of those investigations are concluded swiftly with no media releases, with no need to publicize that person's information, photo, name, that kind of thing. So we need to have a threshold where until that investigation reaches a threshold, we don't put the alert out. So as I said, if we're going to blast something out, whether we're looking at something where foul play, human trafficking, severe bodily harm or death is involved, we're not going to blast everything out to the public. Everybody of the public, I should say. And the other one is being targeted. So if there's no reason to send, or there's no nexus to another city, then keeping it local so that Thunder Bay isn't getting the notifications from Ottawa. unless there's some sort of nexus between the two.
Donc, c'est un peu ce que vous disiez dans vos remarques.
So that's what you were saying in your opening remarks on risk factors. You can talk about that a little more now if you want. I would just like to know, going forward, we've heard how important it is to work in continuum, and that the red dress alert is not a silver bullet. We're looking at the full range of services offered. That means education and others. These, when put together, will give us the tools we need to identify victims and to determine what level of alert needs to be sent out. And then we need to know that we have the legislative tools to implement and that these laws can be followed. We need to see what we can do from a justice perspective to the criminals who are causing these alerts. And then the last element here is a form of help, of care, of giving victims the rehabilitations they need. So we need to consider the red dress alert by looking at this full range of services. And you said in your opening remarks that a follow-up is important on the red dress alert. So could you expand a bit on that? That is the full range of services and the tools you may need to implement them.
Full range of services would obviously begin before we have the need for this red dress alert, and that comes from strengthening our child welfare laws in relation to protecting the at-risk youth from predators, as well as providing additional fundings to the child welfare agencies where all of these children are generally taken from I don't think I have to say, the overrepresentation of children in out-of-home care in these situations of just being missing or human trafficking. Those services having the additional resources available to ensure the kids are getting the proper treatments from whatever trauma they've suffered, the substance abuse issues, lack of housing. It's such a wide spectrum of issues that need to be addressed to prevent these young girls from going missing. Aftercare, when it's a criminal matter, when there's charges laid, I've found, like, while we have a great system in place, obviously additional funding and resources through whatever local victim services are available. Like here in Sudbury, we have the Sudbury Area Victim Services, and they do a fantastic job, but funding is always an issue. And for example, I was in court all week with a young girl who we were able to lay charges against someone who was luring her and grooming her into trafficking. And that matter went on for 2 years, and she had $38 of funding left. So the standards aren't quite what they need as far as that goes. But the services have to be available locally. We're lucky here in Sudbury. We have great services there, but in Pikangikum, they might not, and it needs to be available at home. Did I answer your question?
Oui, absolument.
Absolutely, Mr. Levers. As you said, we also need to build relationships. You spoke of the Nova Scotian model that you've emulated or looked at. You've even looked at models in the United States that have similar alerts. I believe California has one. So it's important to look at what's going on elsewhere and inspire ourselves from that.
I'm now going to pass it over to Leah. I was going to pass it over to Leah Gazan. Leah, 6 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair, and I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here today, and I want to be very clear, my questions are in no way indicative of your intent or you personally, but in terms of the legacy of policing with Indigenous peoples in Canada, history of either over or under policing, and I would say under policing in the cases of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, 2S LGBTQIA+. The National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls Calls for Justice 9.1 to 9.11 made specific calls for justice. I'm wondering which calls to justice your police agency has completed to date. I have a limited time, so.
Daryl, I'll leave that one to you.
I have to, I haven't read all of them personally, but I will say that since the late 90s, Sudbury Police has been played an active role in training our officers and with the help of community, and so that we don't run into those situations here within the city of Greater Sudbury. All of our officers, all of our new recruits come with me. They spend 3 days with me and continue ongoing cultural awareness training, trauma and informed training for their entire career.
Okay, thank you very much. Just because I have a limited time. So I find that deeply troubling because the National Inquiry came out over 4 years ago. You can see my little book here. It's a little pamphlet book. It's probably less than a 1 minute read, in fact. And I think that's indicative of why the relationship continues to be targeted or tarnished, that and direct police violence against Indigenous women. I'm going to give you 2 examples. Northern Manitoba, not sure, I'm certainly not your police department, took an Indigenous woman home in Manitoba with the permission of the sergeant in charge and said, you arrested her, you can do whatever the F you want to do with her. So that's one very extreme example. In Winnipeg, we had the head of the police board come out saying that they were unable to search the landfill. This was announced by the current chief of police to find out that they actually can. The federal government just provided $20 million for it. These calls to justice are very specific, and because you haven't read them, it says, 9.1 says, we call on all police services and justice system actors to acknowledge that the historical and current relationship between Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people and the justice system has been largely defined by colonialism, racism, bias, and discrimination. One of the things that they call for is community oversight, particularly by Indigenous peoples, which includes Indigenous women. Do you currently have oversight of your police services by and for Indigenous people, which includes Indigenous women, in response to this violence?
We actively utilize our Indigenous Advisory Committee. There are members of the Family Information Liaison Unit. A lot of Indigenous women sit on this advisory council and have since its inception. So we are a larger service than a lot in Northern Ontario. And as far as missing persons investigations, we have a dedicated detective. I focus on training and youth programs and building the relationships within the community.
9.7 calls upon police services to partner with frontline organizations that work in service delivery, safety, and harm reduction for Indigenous women, girls, 2S LGBTQIA plus people to expand and strengthen police service delivery. Which organizations are you currently partnered with?
We partner with the Nisswakamuk Native Friendship Center, the Shikagmakwe Health Center, Aboriginal, I'm sorry, we have the acronyms that I'm trying to remember the full name of the program, but the Métis Nation, there's a Compass Child and Family Services, all of the Indigenous child welfare agencies. There are numerous outreach programs.
I'm talking about, I'm talking about organizations that work specifically with Indigenous women and girls, 2S LGBTQIA+. I'm asking that specifically because often the voices of families and people that are directly impacted are excluded from these tables. And so that's really critical to differentiate between the two. But perhaps you could give us a list of ones that are directly related to that. The other...
Yeah, your
sorry.
6 minutes is over. We'll get back to you, though.
Thank
It's okay. Thank you so much. We're now going to go into our second round. So it'll be 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 2.5, 2.5. We'll be able to finish up that round with 4 minutes and 4 minutes. So I'm going to start it off with the first 5 minutes to Anna. Anna, you have the floor for 5.
Chair, and thank you to both the witnesses for being here. So my first question I'm going to direct to Police Officer Daryl Rivers. You stated that you work with the chief of 110 First Nations in Northern Ontario. As the Indigenous liaison officer, you have a good, it seems that you have a good relationship with the First Nations chief and the community. And it sounds like you're doing a great job training all the other police officers. So from your experience, how can your best practices work with other areas in the province and maybe across the country to ensure that, you know, as a nation, we're working together to protect all Indigenous women?
Just to clarify, there are 22 First Nations within 2-hour drive out of Sudbury. We work directly with 2 First Nation communities within our jurisdiction, Atikameksheng First Nishnawbek and Wanapate First Nation. We have a great working relationship directly with the chiefs. As far as working with counterparts, like in my position across the province, we are organizing our inaugural conference for Indigenous liaison officers this coming May. So we would like to share our experiences on how we have built relationships within the Indigenous community within Sudbury and share our programs, share challenges, and come up with solutions so we can assist other services across the province and to help further their goals for building and rebuilding relationships.
Can you explain to the group here what one of your best practices is when you are forming these relationships? What is something that you do to reach out?
We have one of our youth programs. Again, my focus is youth. I do a lot of programming for that. One of the longest running programs we have is a Muckwat Ride-Along program where we engage Indigenous high school students. They come in, they learn about policing. They do a couple of ride-alongs, and then we bring in the elders. Another program that we recently started will be in our 4th year is a moose harvest program. We bring youth from the welfare agencies in. We bring them in for 7 sessions throughout the summer, and there we provide cultural knowledge. We partner with the schools; they get high school credit. This year we're incorporating restorative justice component. And the officers who volunteer for these programs, the big goal is to have the youth see the officers out of their uniform and learn that we are people too. We are not, created and are officers all the time. Those are just 2 of some of the several programs that we have here.
And I appreciate that. So I want to get to another question because we've heard a lot about the human trafficking. Is there, like, when we traveled last year and we went to Sault Ste. Marie, the police force there were in tune with it, and they, basically posted in the airports pictures of individuals that went missing. How do you deal with it?
We had a grant for human trafficking. We had 2 conferences. We focused on frontline workers to provide them information on how to identify signs, key signs where young boys or girls were being trafficked. We also had a presentation series throughout the summer where we invited, again, frontline workers from the child welfare agencies, school boards, to presentations by our detectives in human trafficking to help them identify signs and come up with help and resources for them to address those issues.
Okay, I'll ask quickly. So would you say that the community is helpful when it comes to identifying these situations? Because one of the things that we spoke with earlier in the health committee is that it's torture. It's not abuse, it's torture. Would you agree with that?
Clee?
Very, very, very quickly, kind of more of a yes or no answer. I'm sorry.
Absolutely, it's long sustained destruction
Perfect.
of their person.
Thank you so much. We're now going to move it over for the next 5 minutes to Emanuela. Emanuela, you have the floor.
Madam Chair, and I'd like to thank both of our witnesses for being here to answer some questions today. So my first question is, do all police forces have an Indigenous liaison officer?
They do not.
All right. And would you recommend that all police forces should have an Indigenous liaison officer?
Yes, I do, and that is another one of the goals of the conference that we have coming up. If certain services do not have a dedicated Indigenous liaison officer, I ask for a community response officer who can fulfill that role, and we provide them the information they can take back to their service, and then they can review whether they have capacity to have an office like this in their service.
Thank you. I also was a little bit disappointed to hear that you guys are not necessarily knowledgeable about the calls for justice. However, I do hear in your testimony that there have been actions taken in order to ensure a good relationship with the communities and with which you're working. And so I commend you for that, if it is the truth. Of course, we're only listening to you. And we don't really have, stats to back it, but I do, hear you, and I appreciate that. But I'm asking what you think, given your experience, and I guess this is more for Mr. Rivers, this question, what protocols have been or should be implemented to ensure that the response of law enforcement is culturally appropriate? What are the specific things that you've done and that you would give as a recommendation to other police forces that can do the same in order to better the response and to better the relationship with communities?
I believe that what we do here in Sudbury can be used all across the province with other services. We take every single new recruit. They come through this office to get cultural awareness training, which is focused on knowledge that they can use at certain situations at calls for service. We continue the training with our officers every year, and we have plans for we're in the creation of a knowledge bundles video series, which will have one topic that we're going to create an hour, 45-minute long video that all members can access. And each year it'll be on a different topic. We're in the process of editing the first one in that series, which was on residential schools. And also a lot of the programs that we have, we get a lot of officers volunteering their time to participate in the MOVES program, the MUCWA program. We just finished a new lacrosse program. There's a version of lacrosse that's played in the Great Lakes region. We brought in culture, history, knowledge keepers for that. So I think there's a lot of opportunity.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Call for Justice 9.5 asks for all police services calls upon all police services for the standardization of protocols for policies and practices that ensure that all cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and to us LGBTQIA people are thoroughly investigated. And so I'm wondering who exactly would be responsible if this were to be standardized? Who would be responsible to make that happen, and who would that command come from?
We do have a dedicated equity, diversity, and inclusion sergeant who, in partnership with this office, we identify any gaps and we try to address as best as we can. As far as missing persons protocols and policies, Detective Levers is our most knowledgeable person with that.
But I guess what I'm saying is, like, is it the province that's responsible? Is it the government of Canada? Like, who exactly would be the one to give you the instruction if they were to standardize a certain protocol?
As policing is covered by the province, if there was that's where it would have the standardized protocol would have to be based. If you wanted all the services in Ontario, it would have to be Ontario. I don't see how a federal mandate would work.
Okay, thank you. I think my time is up.
Thank you very much. We're now going to move it over for 2.5 minutes, and I'll pass it over to Adrienne. Adrienne?
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to follow up on what my colleagues just said. How do you perceive the red dress alert within the greater context of reconciliation at a time when you know nothing of the calls to justice? How do you see this link that must be done? We need to have a nation-to-nation dialogue, but you don't even know about the calls to justice. This is seems like a rather difficult task.
To say that we don't know about the calls to justice, I think, while I don't know the specific numbers to when she referenced 9.1 to 9.11, I can't cite those, but we as a service, myself as an individual police officer, are deeply committed to building those relationships and have been throughout my history as a police officer. I don't know if you want to expand on that, Daryl.
Again, when I said that was me personally, not us as a service. We do work very hard to address all concerns within the city of Greater Sudbury, and we strongly utilize our Indigenous Advisory Committee when issues, concerns from the community are raised. We address them as they come in.
Okay, donc maintenant pour
Now to get back to a question that I asked in my last round of questions and I didn't receive an answer for. You've explained the partnerships you've had with certain community chiefs, but have you also been looking what's going on in California or in other U.S. states where these kind of alerts exist in order to incorporate their experience? There are also organizations that work on human trafficking that have initiatives, the initiatives Pardon ma ville. Interpretation check 1 2. 1 2.
Me? Okay. And Adrienne, can you speak in French to see whether we can get the English or
Oui,
French?
bonjour, je parle en français. Est-ce que je
Yes, I'm speaking in English. Can I start? I'm speaking in French. Can I restart my question?
Go forward.
Okay, donc voilà. Donc
As I was saying, to get to what I was asking in an earlier round, have you looked at other U.S. states they've implemented similar alert systems? Have you looked at those in order to inform your approach going forward? We know that California has one. Have you also looked at the experience of other organizations working in human trafficking? Example, Pas dans ma ville, which is an organization that has a foothold in certain airports to identify women in distress. Has your research extended to those organizations?
I primarily looked at two different alert systems, I guess is the word to use, within Canada in relation to missing youth. One is run by, and I'm blanking on the names of them, but they're both subscription-based alerts. I can
Perfect.
provide those to the council later.
Absolutely, Clee. Thank you so much. Our time is running short there, so if you could do that, we would greatly appreciate it. I'll pass it over for 2.5 minutes to Leah.
Thank you so much, Chair. Just very quickly, on your Indigenous committee, how many are women, Indigenous women? What's the number? Quickly,
We have
please.
about 15 in total. I'd say there was about half.
Okay. So through the consultations and certainly things we've heard in committee, in fact, every consultation, people said they didn't trust police services across the country. In fact, it was coast to coast with making decisions about when alerts were issued. Call to Justice 9.5 calls on police services to establish an independent special investigation unit for the investigation of incidents of failure to investigate police misconduct and all forms of discriminatory practices and mistreatment of Indigenous peoples within their police force. The Special Investigation Unit must be transparent in practice and report at least annually to Indigenous communities, leadership, and people in their jurisdiction. I'm wondering, in the spirit of reconciliation, knowing the violent history, particularly between police forces and Indigenous women to us LGBTQI+, whether you'd be open to having independent oversight and on matters impacting MMIWG2S. And if you do have oversight in place right now, do you have oversight specifically geared to ending the I would say, epidemic of systemic racism within policing?
We have a professional standards bureau that oversees all complaints made to the service from the general public.
So I want to move on to the next question, because I have very little time, about being open to oversight, independent oversight by independent women or people chosen by the Indigenous community to make sure that your conduct is appropriate.
I think that would be a question for our senior leadership of the police service.
Thank you very much. We're going to finish off, and we will start with 4 minutes for Dominique, 4 minutes, and I think that's Lisa. Go ahead, Dominique.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you for being with us tonight. I'll start us off right now. We don't have a lot of time. Clearly, from what I understand, a redress alert, or rather you agree with the redress alert in principle, with the approach. Should the redress alert be a national alert?
I think we should be able to put one out nationally when it's called for. However, I think we need to focus the alerts in areas where you've got your highest, where the investigation's leading you. Because if we were to put one out nationally for every missing Indigenous woman, the alert just, it will be less effective. You don't receive a severe storm warning alert every single time it rains halfway across the country. It has to be focused so that those national level alerts really ring true and hold the weight and capture the attention.
Monsieur, Monsieur le détective.
Detective, currently, if my memory is right, you spoke of 600 people who are declared missing every year. Is that the case?
Monsieur Levers.
Detective Levers.
We have approximately 1,500 people reported missing every year. And as I said, the vast majority are resolved very quickly and without the need for media releases, without the need for alerts. As of those 1,500 approximately, we're around slightly over half are Indigenous women, generally speaking.
J'aimerais ça que vous nous expliquiez plus avant. Il y a Madame Mélanie.
Ms. Melanie Omenyo testified earlier this week, and she said that it can be more problematic to search for some women publicly because there are security issues that might come into play. Did you have to face, or rather, have you faced this kind of situation where it was better to be discreet in your search instead of using an alert?
Absolutely. In particular, in cases of human trafficking, when we do have to be wary of what the individual who's trafficked them may do if it's posted publicly. It is a balancing act sometimes.
Quand vous ouvrez mon micro, moi, j'entends.
When my mic gets open, I don't really hear the witness. One last question. I'd like to get back to a comment that my colleague, Mrs. Gazin, said. Everything here that we're talking about is based on trust. Everything in this study, on the red dress study and the red dress alert, is based on trust. I know this might be a long-winded question, but there seems to be a lack of trust in police services. How can we square this circle? You know, on the one hand, we want to help Indigenous women and girls. We want to have Indigenous women and girls benefit from the decisions, but we also want to bring police into these decision-making process. How do we reconcile both of these things?
I think one of the main components is you need to get involved. You need to go out, identify all your resources, Indigenous organizations within the city or your municipality, wherever you're residing, and reach out and make connections and attend their meetings, go to any initiatives that they have, support them, and in turn, invite them to sit on your advisory committee and have open, honest dialogue.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And for the final round, we're going to pass it over to Lisa. Lisa, 4 minutes.
Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I'm going to go back again to this. I guess I'd like to hear from you how you envision police being involved in a red dress alert. Because as you've heard from my colleagues today and as we've discussed, there is a lack of trust between Indigenous communities and police forces across the country for very good reasons. What we've heard at this committee, I think, is that most Indigenous people would prefer to have a committee of particularly Indigenous women who oversee the red dress alert. And I think Detective Constable Lievers, I think you were talking about the thresholds of when to send out a red dress alert. And typically for Amber Alert, it's the police who decide when to send out the alert. But I think we're envisioning a different process for the red dress alert. So could you sort of describe to us exactly how you see police being involved? As you mentioned, you believe there should be collaboration with police forces across the country. How specifically do you see police should be involved?
If we're talking about the large scale, like our highest tier of alert where we're blasting out to the entire public, obviously we need to be involved in that. At least we can back check the story behind the missing person. To give an example, I once got a complaint from a male who was looking to locate his ex. Obviously, she did not want to be found by him. She was perfectly safe. We need to be able to at least vet who's getting posted out so that we're not endangering that person. The logistics of how that goes out is obviously a much bigger decision. But I think we need to be involved in that conversation. If it's going to be run by Indigenous women, we have to have, it's going to be difficult because it's going to have, you're going to have to clusters within the country, province, however, to make these decisions and decide on these cases, because unfortunately there are so many that could go out. And I don't want the public to look at alert and say, oh, I've seen that name before, and just forget it. Because I've seen it with our media releases, and it's distressing because it stops people from looking.
Thank you for bringing up the point about how some women don't want to be found. And it's not in some cases, it's women who are missing, that they're not missing, they're hiding because they don't want to be found, because perhaps if they're found, they're in more danger. How do you deal with that now? How do you decide? How do you know?
Well, and that comes from doing the investigation. That example I brought up was actually very simple because I found a number for her she had moved to a different jurisdiction, but I had access to their records. I called her up and she said, well, no, I don't even want to tell you where I am, let alone him. He has no right. And I was able to shut that down and deal with that male, caution him for what he was doing. But you have to be able to put some investigation into it, and it's a case-by-case basis on how you come to that conclusion.
Thank you. And you also mentioned that you didn't see how a federal mandate would work for a red dress alert. Can you clarify what you mean by that? Often, I mean, if somebody is say, a victim of trafficking in Nova Scotia, they could be transported to British Columbia. So in some sense, it makes sense to have a national level alert system.
It absolutely makes sense to have a national level alert system when the case calls for it. I think what I meant when it doesn't make it be difficult to do nationally is if you're going to have one body looking at which case gets to go out or which case gets posted, the volume might be daunting, time of day, things like that. So maybe I misspoke or was misunderstood, but that's kind of what I meant. I think a national level alert, when called for, is essential. It's just how we do it.
Thank you.
On behalf of the committee, I would very much like to thank the two of you for coming here and providing this testimony. I know that it provides us the other side of what we're talking about, so I'd like to thank you very much. I'm going to remind the committee we are going to suspend for a moment. We will be getting back. Yeah, point of order? Okay. Go ahead, say something.
Just quickly.
Quick.
I just want to say...
Not a question.
It's not a question. No. I just want to congratulate Daryl. I understand that you were nominated for an award, which I forgot to mention in my testimony. Okay. So I know we don't have time to find out what that was, but... It was Rookie of the Year. Okay. Rookie of the Year. Oh,
Rookie of the Year. Rookie of the... Well, congratulations. That's wonderful. Anyway, thank you. Thanks very much. We are going to suspend. We'll be coming back to some committee business. I'm going to remind everybody, one staff member and one member from each whip's office. We are in camera. Suspension for about 5.